There we go. First, the first real discussion of nuclear terrorism that amounted to anything, there were some discussions of it in the mid-1940s, 1946 in particular. I've selected one of them because I think the cover is very useful in explaining why people were interested in this concern about nuclear terrorism. This was referred to in an essay, which is identified here by Mr. Condon, who was head of the Westinghouse labs during the Manhattan Project. And he wrote in this piece, in this edited volume, something about what he called anonymous war. It's a great phrase, anonymous war. Why did they have this in a book called One World or None? Does anybody here know what people were talking about when they talked about one world in 1946 when it came to nuclear things? What were they referring to? Does anybody hazard a guess?
A one world government to
That's it.
Nuclear security.
There you go. So that there would have to be a surrendering of sovereignty to some extent for the international control of nuclear energy, and that the international control of nuclear energy was absolutely essential, because if we didn't have that, we would swallow each other whole. Paraphrasing Hillel. That one weapon would beget another. The spread of these would beget use, and use would destroy the cities, and the cities with civilization, and that was it. And we had just gone through a war where we had nearly done that without nuclear weapons, you see, at least in Europe and a lot of places. Asia. I mean, there was a massive destruction of urban areas that were historically very important. It's a miracle that they've been rebuilt, considering what they were, the state they were in 1945. In any case, everybody had a pretty clear picture of how bad that might be. And the bomb, after all, was initially a city crusher. That's what it was all about. And arguably, it still, to some extent, is viewed that way. Actually, to a very great extent still. So why would they connect these two ideas? Well, in 1946, there actually was a debate about whether or not nuclear weapons in the hands of states would necessarily require world government. There's an essay that I didn't assign by Jacob Viner. This essay, I think, was he was an economist. It was sort of the beginning of real profound thought at places like the Rand Corporation about how you might have more than one nation with nuclear weapons, but you might not have nuclear war. They might deter one another. And he laid out some pretty good arguments, so did some others. Well, so there might be some defenses. It might not be that easy to knock out the other fellow's ability to strike second. Maybe you didn't need one world. Maybe you didn't need world government. And as Mr. Viner said, people who say everyone who doesn't believe in world government has their head in the sand actually doesn't realize that they have their head in the clouds. That's a pretty good line. Well, one way to trump that debate and shut everyone up and get you back on track to one world would be to say, what about anonymous war? You can't deter that, you see. You can't detect that, you see. You can't attribute that so easily. Aha! We have to control nuclear energy. You're back on track. So the Atchison-Lilienthal report used a line about nuclear terrorism in it. It was no accident. I don't know if Mr. Baruch brought it up when he defended his plan at the UN, but you get the drift. The reason there was interest in this had to do with justifying the solution to this and other problems associated with nuclear energy's control, at least in 1946. Now, what's interesting, you can go to the next slide, is how long it took from 1946 for this topic to come up again. It took a couple of weeks, I can tell you that. There wasn't much. If you do a literature search, there's very little discussion of this until the 1970s. Now, I'm looking in the room. I see someone in sort of my age cohort over here. He's smiling. Of course, you're probably a lot younger than I am. But you may have lived through the 70s. The rest of you, you have to take my word for this, okay? These things happened. What if I was to tell you that in the decade from 2002 to 2013, now you all experienced that at some level, no? Yes, unless you were watching too much television. 61 people were killed on U.S. soil. And there were a total of 214 acts of terrorism. And for this, there has been a tremendous excitement. The organizing principle of our government, roughly, has become to fight the war on terrorism. What people forget, however, is that in the decade, roughly from, 1970 to 1979, roughly, there were actually not 214, but 9,840 incidences of recorded terrorism worldwide, and more than 7,000 people were killed. Now, in the case of the U.S., there still was an enormous number. It was 1,470 and 184 killed. So actually, terrorism in its kind of bold, simple, metrics of incidents and people killed was worse than it is now. And we have a hard time getting our mind around this. But this uptick was very important, and it was important not just because of these numbers, which I think are surprising even to me. I mean, when I saw these numbers, I went, wow, really? I didn't know that. What was very different about these acts of terrorism from those that had occurred before was that by 1970, every single American who was at all of any means whatsoever had a television. All of these events, I picked just two. One has to do with the hijacking of some planes that occurred, and the other has to do with the killing of some Israeli athletes in Munich in the Olympics. All of these were televised into people's bedrooms. Everyone saw this. This was new at two levels then. Okay, keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. The reason we'll come back to that, actually we'll come back to it right now, is there was a lot of writing about, well, what if these folks didn't just have a gun or explosives? Please don't show that chart. Could you go back?
Sorry.
Please go back. Please go back. Well, we can't say. There we go. No need to, if there aren't pictures, I'm not going to try to inflict it on you. There were two books that there were many more than two books, but one I remember reading in graduate school at the University of Chicago was called Nuclear Theft, Risks and Safeguards. And it was by a man, two people, Theodore Taylor, and Mason Wildridge. Now, Theodore Taylor was a weapons designer, knew a thing or two about bomb design, and Mason Wildridge, someone I know, was at that time very interested in civil nuclear energy and safeguards. So they co-authored this book, and in those days, it's a little different. In those days, it was very hard to produce a book or a report. You had to use whiteout. They didn't have word processing. Xerox, yes, but mostly you did duplicates with carbon copies. Books were harder to produce, and if they came from some reputable place like the Ford Foundation, well, you stopped. People actually read it, and a lot of people read it. Whereas today, very hard to get anything read because so much is produced. Some of it even worth reading, but who would know? It's sandwiched in between thousands of titles that are worthless. And, you know, they all kind of say similar things, so you can't even know what's important. Back then, this report from the Ford Foundation was a big deal, and particularly since no one much talked about nuclear weapons in public. In any case, what they said is it's not so difficult to get material diverted, even under IEA safeguards, and it's not that difficult maybe to make a bomb. This was kind of chilling. The counterpoint was another book by someone who I know as well, and in fact I think I asked you to read something of his, Brian Jenkins. And he wrote a short note, RAND Report P5541. By the way, all this is, you know, on the notes, so you don't have to take notes. Will terrorists go nuclear? And one of the things he said that was really interesting was a simple sentence. He said, terrorists are more interested in having a lot of people standing around watching than a lot of people dead. And this gets back to this point about television. If you could do an event that showed just you know, people dead, but not that many, but get a lot of people to look at it and think about it, that was leverage. It wasn't just the numbers of people you killed. It was how many were watching. I think he, for that reason, was skeptical about how soon nuclear terrorism would become a problem, because after all, you might be able to get a lot of people to watch for a long time before you had to resort to nuclear explosives. Pretty thoughtful, because I think he was on to something. Now, he did not say it would never become a problem. He just said it would take more time. Now, if you jump to the slide beyond the next one, there you go, the next one. There you go, stop. I find this, I made this discovery in putting this together for you. I didn't realize that the nuclear emergency support team has this as their badge. It's a little over the top, if you ask me. And the reason I say that is I don't know what the secret is. It's possibly that they have yet to find anyone who had a nuclear weapon. The genesis of this organization is itself interesting. As a result of the acts of terrorism during the 70s, in the midst of this, there was an FBI report from an extortionist who wanted $200,000. He claimed he had a nuclear weapon somewhere in Boston. So the Atomic Energy Commission was rushed up with radiation detection gear to somehow find this. Of course, the radiation gear arrived at an airport different than the team that was going to use it, and they rented a fleet of vans to carry these radiation detectors around the city, but forgot to bring the tools needed to install the equipment. Luckily, the entire threat was a hoax. But President Ford said, wow, I don't want to depend on good luck in the future. And he created this nuclear emergency support team, which was supposed to do a better job than the Atomic Energy Commission did. So that was the first kind of governmental, bureaucratic response to the question of nuclear terrorism that I know of, and that's 74. I just want to make sure I get this order. Yeah, I think there wasn't much that happened with regard to nuclear terrorism after the creation of this unit. There was something, and you can go to the next slide, that happened by the late 70s. Now, this is not someone that most of you would be familiar with. I actually had to deal with him and his staff when I worked in the Pentagon. He's no longer with us. But Richard Kennedy was a commissioner on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I don't know why that's committee. It should be commission. Something to correct. And he later served as ambassador at large at the State Department. He was a very keen promoter of nuclear power internationally. He liked to see it spread. He was very concerned that this was the energy source of the future. And one of the things that he thought was absolutely important was that there be an international convention on the protection of nuclear materials to limit the threat of nuclear terrorism, because he understood, or he was concerned, that if that threat ever was realized, that would be the end of nuclear power. So in a sense, we had to make the world safe for nuclear power. That's what this convention was about. Now, the convention was negotiated, and then finally signatures went on it in 1979. It came into force in 1987. I think this is another important governmental response. It certainly helped bolster the idea that we needed efforts later that were described roughly under the moniker of nuclear threat reduction, which is an enormous enterprise of government now. What is interesting to me is he thought that this focus on the convention on physical protection was far more important than enforcing existing treaties, such as the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, or at least he thought it deserved a really enormous amount of time to focus on getting this up. It is during this period, however, that we have the problem of Iraq trying to get a bomb, the Indians and the Pakistanis developing their nuclear capabilities and the like. I mean, a cynical cut on this would be, did this distract us? I think the argument would be no, it didn't. This was just additive. I think government was big enough to do both. But there is an argument some people make that the focus on nuclear terrorism and physical security can sometimes draw people away from more uncomfortable conversations. We'll come back to that. When you have nuclear security summits, everyone enjoys themselves. Large numbers of people come. But what they can agree to is pretty limited. And we'll get back to that later in the presentation. Okay, what's the next slide? So that was roughly the 80s. There was not that much concern about nuclear terrorism in the 80s. Could you go back one, please? There's a slide missing, I think.
Yes, sorry.
Could you go back? There we go. The speed of light. Okay. Well, the vacation from terrorism per se stopped pretty much this decade. We had domestic events, Oklahoma City, Waco, Texas, and embassy bombings with enormous truck bombs. And then we had this Japanese character. Now, he certainly attempted a chemical attack in a subway in Tokyo, but they were also interested in what else? Does anybody remember this Mr. Shorinko leader? Well, biological. But in the out years, what was he interested in? Oh, nuclear. Well, people who were in the threat generation business looked at this and said, oh boy, we've got something now. It's interesting. I was in the Pentagon in 89, 90, 91, 92, a little bit in 93. And what happened next was that there was a welling up of interest in creating the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. Now, that was commonsensical in many respects, which is the Russians had not 20, but 40,000 nuclear warheads, way beyond anything we had and way beyond anything they needed. And, somehow accounting for these things and keeping them from, going astray and decommissioning them seemed like a really good idea. They even thought it was. So that's one point. But it wasn't long into that program that people said, oh, we have to make sure that this material, know-how, et cetera, doesn't end up in the wrong hands. And by that, they meant not just countries we didn't like, but people like our Japanese friend here. So it sort of morphed into protecting the material against seizure. Now, if you could go to the next slide. In fact, the people most responsible for the cooperative threat reduction in '97, not that many years after the cooperative threat reduction program was put up, said, oh, well, we have to make sure that the U.S. Civil defense is there if there's a chemical, biological, or nuclear event on our soil. Now, I have to remind you that, all of this occurs right after the fall of the wall. And at this point, the defense requirements are unclear. What is it that the U.S. military is supposed to address is open to question. And in a sense, these threats were talked about a great deal. You had the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Cohen, sitting with a bag of sugar saying, well, imagine if this was anthrax, how horrible this would be. That's unusual, that would be what the Secretary of Defense would be focused on. I can remember distinctly right before the first Iraq War being dragged into a meeting in which a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, Joshua Lederberg, was holding forth, and there was a meeting, and there was a deputy undersecretary, there was two assistant secretaries, a bunch of deputy assistant secretaries. Because I had the N word in my title, non-proliferation, I was dragged into that meeting, although put to the side, because I think I was somewhat junior. I was at the deputy assistant secretary level. And they went through and wrung their hands about what to do. Mr. Lederberg had asked, well, what are you going to do if Saddam sends an anthrax letter bomb into the Pentagon? Since it has kind of onomatopoeia about it, it had to be a threat that existed because it rhymed, and we had been seeing and thinking about all this. And the response was quite amazing. Nobody knew what to say. They said, Centers for Disease Control, Arlington Fire Department, hands wrung, people repeated it, that went around the room. So, what they were proposing was to search every single person who came into the Pentagon. Now, I suspect, do that. I don't know, who has been at the Pentagon recently? Anybody here?
So I work there now.
If you're an employee, do they wave you in or not?
So you just card in, but they have random searches, usually like once every 2 weeks. So
Okay.
it's not every day, but it is randomized.
Okay. Well, at the time, I had staff, I don't know how to say this diplomatically, I had persuaded to come to work every day, including Mondays. I gave my receptionist flowers, and it worked. I think she might have had a drinking problem, so that coming in on Mondays was not easy. What they were proposing to do might push her over the top. I mean, I never see her again. They're going to look at her purse. I said, let's think about this. Do we have a problem or a solution here? At the time, we were trying to figure out, how do we get the American public to be persuaded to support a land invasion of Iraq? We couldn't, and the best James Baker, who was arguing at the time, was, well, what was it? Oh, we need to invade to protect Saudi Arabia because there's oil there, and oil is jobs, and we need to. Well, nobody was. That went over like a lead balloon. So I said, if someone sent a letter bomb and it was from Saddam, and we could show that, solve the problem. I mean, we would have all the support we need in the world. I said, there's a little wrinkle. I mean, everybody in this room might be dead. But, we all swore to defend the Constitution. I mean, roughly, I'd be willing to give my bureaucratic life, if it protected the country. I'm sure the American military could fight the war without us. But everyone was almost willing to get sucked into thinking that, well, we had to do everything and stop everything to deal with a hypothetical threat dealing with the anthrax letter bomb. They decided that day, as a result of my intervention, not to do anything. Now, it could be now, given that letter bombs have been used, by the way, they had not been yet, maybe there's a different take. Maybe, you have to be more careful. But this showed you that right in the midst of a war, we were talking about shutting the Pentagon down to do searches. It gives you the flavor of this. The next slide. I feel like we're talking to a different country. There we go. Well, everyone knows these pictures, I think. We focus on 9/11, but there is a book by Graham Allison about terrorism that starts off with something that is 10/11, which is 1 month later. I don't know if it's true. I'm inclined to think it is. What he does is he tells a story, much like the incident with Mr. Ford, but now with W, that there was a report, single source report, that there was someone from Iraq in New York with a nuclear weapon, and that they were going to set it off. And he again sent a nest team up. Of course, they didn't find anything, and it again turned into a hoax. However, what Graham Allison argues, and I think it's plausible, is that as a result of the drama associated with that hoax, the President of the United States decided that he was going to make sure that Saddam could never do that. The rest, I think, is history. No? That brings us to the next slide. There we go. The war on terror. We have been engaged since 2001 fighting ISIS in Afghanistan, arguably in Syria and Iraq, using drones and the like. This has been a war that has gone on without end. But it has been certainly a driver of defense requirements, a driver of legal requirements for the ability to search and to overhear or store information on communications. It is one of the, if not the most important, it may well be the most important organizing principle to explain government activity and the use of force or the threat of force for at least a decade, for quite a long time. The Bush administration, the Obama administration at a minimum. Now, that's of interest because we've now progressed to a state very different than, let's say, the 1960s, very different than the 1950s, and arguably different in every respect from what we used to be. Now, the justification and discussion of this set of activities certainly can be dealt with on its own terms, which is, well, what if these people come over to the United States, right? So we want to nip the problem of terrorism before it progresses by coming to our borders. I think implicit in this, though, is also the notion that whatever they might do or could do is getting worse and worse. If you take a look at the kinds of things that are going on in Iraq, or even, for that matter, in the Middle East in general, terrorist organizations now have large tanks. They have missiles that are of long range. Quite long range, hundreds of miles. So the imagination doesn't have to go very far before you come to the conclusion that, well, part of this is to keep things from getting so bad that we have to suffer what is described in the next chart. Why don't you bring that up? Here we go. And I think the most immediate and extreme threat to global security is how Mr. Obama described nuclear terrorism, and that was, I think, in 2000. I believe in 9 or 10. I think it was 9. I remember when this was first stated, I talked with his top advisor on WMD. I said, you didn't tell him to use those words, did you? He immediately said, well, no, not at all. And the reason I asked, and the reason he denied he had, is immediate seems hard to show, and we'll get to this in a moment. Extreme is even difficult. I mean, if you had an exchange, as someone pointed out in the Arms Control Association, if you had an exchange of nuclear weapons between two countries, you might destroy a whole slew of cities, not just one or two. But this is the way it was framed. And in fact, Mr. Obama went further, perhaps in his desire to have closer relations with Russia. I don't know. Russia doesn't pose the number one national security threat. I continue to be much more concerned when it comes to national security with the prospect of a nuclear weapon going off in Manhattan. This has then led to sort of the primacy of the next slide of diplomatic activity. The nuclear security summits. We held 4 of them. It was a big to-do. Now, no, please go back. Thank you. I guess I have an image of someone in a remote room somewhere. Okay. These summits, you can see they had the leaders of the Western world at these things. It was quite remarkable. Remarkable because what you could get agreement to was pretty much limited. I mean, you could get agreement. I should say that different. You could get agreement and you could get a meeting easily to a lot of things, like nuclear terrorism is bad. We should secure our materials that might be used to make bombs, and we should, make sure that it's difficult for people to break in and difficult for people to steal things. After that, though, a number of these meetings, at each of these meetings, there would be announcement of someone giving up some highly enriched uranium at some reactor, in one case, some weapons-grade plutonium in the case of Japan, and repatriating it to mostly the United States. But I think in some cases, some of the material went back to Russia. And that was important, but those activities were ongoing before, although I think these summits helped to get those repatriations. The one set of issues that was never really seriously engaged in, however, was, where is your material? How much of it do you have? Because you didn't want someone to overwhelm your security of that material. You didn't want someone to bomb it. You didn't want someone to take it. Not only the terrorists, but other states. So it had a kind of strange quality. Certain topics, including plutonium reprocessing, weren't covered very well because there were agreements that said, roughly and formally, we'll go to these summits, but only if you don't bring these topics up, because we have a commercial reprocessing program, let's say in India, France, Russia, and Japan. And so certain topics didn't get talked about as fulsomely as they could. In any case, we're now in a different presidency. It's interesting, if you take a look at the national security documents, and there are, I think, 3, one by the Defense Department, one that came out of the White House on national security strategy, and I guess the Nuclear Posture Review. At least 2 of those downplay the problem of terrorism. I don't think they go out of their way to downplay nuclear terrorism. They just don't address it. So we're now in a slightly different rhetorical mode. Now we're worried about states and competing against states: Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia, principally.